bit doesn't get you very far at all.
Can I just answer, Ed?
Yeah.
Okay. The language that the legislature adopted only asked for options that address. And if you have an option in there that doesn't address, then to me, you're not really complying with this language.
Already, Sharon? On that, oh,
I was gonna say, so,
hang on a second. Paul, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I didn't jump Sharon well.
that's okay.
If you
Go
can
ahead.
go ahead and plug back in. Go ahead.
Good, okay. I'm just trying to process what you just said, Ian, in terms of, so SCR 105 talks about addressing the long-term funding needs. And our edict, I mean, you mentioned something earlier, you used the term, you're comfortable with this board making a recommendation. But all the way along in this conversation and our conversation with our constituency groups that we've had multiple meetings, multiple conversations. We've made it very clear that our role is to provide information. We're providing information to the legislature, and at the end of the day, it's the legislature that makes the decision. And so it seems like the sticking point for us is there some of the information that we're providing this report that would somehow breach our fiduciary duty because it would be inconsistent with the counsel of our actuaries, correct? With the 75-year?
That's what I'm thinking, that, again, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an actuary.
Right,
But if
right.
your actuaries are advising you that it doesn't address, then I question, and I think you should question whether it should be provided as an option.
Right.
And also whether, it complies with the request that, that you come up with options that address the long-term funding needs. As I said, you're not required to make a recommendation. As fiduciaries, you have to decide whether you want to make a recommendation. I think that's up to you. But I don't think you're required to.
Right, but I guess what's challenging for me, Ian, as you say that, is this is I feel like we're at the end of a process. We've had multiple meetings. Our board has been very aware of every single iteration of a report that Ed has given us. We've met with stakeholders. We've gotten their input. So I think what I'm saying is I feel like, and I hope we've been clear that our role is to provide information to the legislature. And so as you bring in the recommendation piece, I guess I just balk at that because I think that's changing it a little bit at the end. And I think that we've been really clear that our role is informational. But I think the conversation that we're having around what to do with, Milliman's report and this piece is a fair question to say, okay, well, is that a breach of our fiduciary duty if we have that in there and that could be part of the information that we provide, and would that somehow breach our fiduciary duty, which is what I think I hear coming from other people.
Yeah, I mean, I've been influenced by Milliman's report in the 30-year, and what Nick just said to you, which I hadn't seen before. And I'm not saying that has to be the choice, but I am saying that, in my opinion, the options you provide, should be options that if the legislature adopted them, Milliman and your staff would not tell you that it's unacceptable and put you on the spot to tell the legislature, whoops, even though it was in our list of options, maybe we didn't make it clear enough, but that doesn't work.
Paul?
Ian made the point I was going to make, which is that, yes, we've gone through a process, but we only just now heard from Milliman. And then based on what Milliman told us, we heard from Ian. And we weren't asked by the legislature to submit recommendations, and we weren't asked by the legislature to produce scenarios that improve things. We were asked by the legislature to provide scenarios that address the funding problem. So to limit our options to 30-year options is not to make a recommendation. To limit our options to 30-year options is to comply with the legislature's request that we provide options that address the funding problem. And there are several options that we show in this report. 4 of the 8 scenarios are 30 years. But I can't I can't put it all together, what SCR 105 asks for, what the numbers show, what Nick is telling us, what Ian is telling us, that we can include 75-year options in this report.
Rich?
I guess I look at this just a trifle differently. I mean, if we could say with confidence that we know what the future is and therefore could plot out exactly where we want to be, we could give a recommendation that you can go this far and no further with any safety, or you should be exactly here to get where you want with an outcome. We don't get to do that because we don't know what the future is. I do think, unlike Ian, I do think there is some point to telling the legislature sort of where the bottom of the bucket is. That if you go below this, you've not done nearly enough, that this won't get you there. Because my experience with the legislature is they're going to keep looking for that spot, because it's probably politically the most palatable for them, is to go as far down in the bucket as you can possibly get and still claim you've solved the problem. I think we do have some responsibility, and maybe we should be clearer about it, as saying, we think if you go this far, you've gone too far, and you're not meeting the appropriate requirements to make the funds fiduciarily sound. But we do need to show them where sort of the bottom of the hole is, because otherwise they will keep looking for it. So I
That's a good point.
I mean, this is that, it's human nature, right? It's just like, my friend Pedro is in this incredible pickle here because he wants to do the right thing but you know, at the end of the day, they're also gonna look for the cheapest way out, because that's what you do at the end of the day. And so I do think that there's something to be said that we ought to make it real clear that this point down is too far. Don't go this far down. Stay up above this. That's meeting our responsibilities. If I had more confidence in our precision to pick where we're going to be in a certain spot, I would pick that. And if we were in charge of that, we would have the ability to adapt more quickly. One of the problems we have in this system is that adapting to changing positions is really hard, because you have to go back over and you have to pass legislation. You have to listen. Everybody's reluctant to do it. It's hard to go up. It's hard to go down. You tend to make mistakes because of that, right? Because of the difficulty of it. So my inclination, I think the report is pretty close. I think maybe we should be a little stronger about saying that this one is these most optimistic, lengthiest, least rigorous, I don't know what the right word, set of scenarios is too far for the board to handle, and frankly, we don't think you should be there. And I think that meets our responsibility. And I have to say, as I've said before, anything that makes it better is a really good start. And what I want them to do is get started at making things better. It would be nice if we picked a spot we thought would be sweet to go for, and we ought to try to encourage them to do that, recognizing the imprecision of that.
So Ed, before I go to Grant, can you remind us who all sat in the stakeholder group meetings, and also what the plan is after we submit this? In my mind, I thought we were gonna start making visits to legislators.
Right.
And so, I mean, that would be an opportunity for us to express our viewpoint, correct?
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about who was on the stakeholder group and the plan moving forward?
Well, I mean, we had representatives of a variety of the people that we're used to dealing with, as well as legislative staff, were in these discussions. So I'm not sure. Do you
So
want?
it was committee staff?
It was legislative policy committee staff. Yes, Senate and Assembly.
Senate and Assembly?
Yeah.
All righty, thank you. Jennifer, I see that you're back there. If there's anyone else from, I don't know if you're waiting to speak. If there are any other members of the public that would like to speak on the issue, if you could make your way to a microphone. When we are done with, I have Grant, and then Pedro. I'll come to the public, or the stakeholder groups that were there. So Grant, you're up next.
Thank you. I agree with the comments that Rich was just making. I want to start by saying Treasurer Lockyer for a long time has felt that ultimately the fix for CalSTRS will come when there's a broader fix for the way that we fund public education. But with respect to this report, he feels strongly that whether it's the form of recommending for something or against something, we ought to make it very clear. And I had some discussions with Ian, and he said in terms of what he could recommend or does recommend or recommends against, the test for him is actuarial soundness. And, you know, like Nick was saying, there is no one, that's sort of a broad definition, but there's an American Academy of Actuary task force on the concept of actuarial soundness that really gives little guidance. But I mean, I think if you look between 30 years and 75 years, I don't think, if we could set contributions, I don't think Milliman would tell us to shoot for 75 years. So.
I understand that Grant brought up your name too, and I saw that you went like this, and I skipped you.
All I wanted to say is possibly one way to address what Rich raised is not using it as an option, you know, not ignoring it either. So including it in the paper that's sent over, but, you know, just explain why it might not work if that's what Nick and Rick feel or are telling you. So just don't call it an option.
I think that we call them scenarios.
Or-
It's,
Well, or scenario, I mean, okay.
yeah, maybe we don't call it anything, we just leave it. Ed?
Yeah, you know, from my perspective, it seems like we're dealing with a variety of different issues. The one issue is and it's sort of consistent with what we laid it out. For one issue is what is the objective that is trying to be achieved, and we could identify, and those are the options at least as we saw it. And so you might question whether some options should be presented as true options in light of what Ian is saying, but I still think it's valuable to provide information about the consequences of different approaches. But we're not identifying it as an option, one funding stream or one funding period over another one. They're just simply variations of that option. And again, if it's an issue of we want to provide information so people understand the consequences of 30 years versus 75 years and the good things about it and the bad things about it, and if the board feels that we need to strengthen the argument as to why doing it as quickly as possible is better, we can certainly do that. But it just seems like there's a variety of different decisions that you're looking at in terms of how you want to cast or how you want to set the tone on this report.
And I'd like to remind everyone that this report is due in 4 days. So a major rewrite is probably not an option. Pedro?
Madam Chair, Rich brought my name up, and I was really just gonna sit here and listen, but since he brought my name up, I have to say something, I guess. I wish I were in a pickle, because then I wouldn't age as much. But I don't feel like I'm in a pickle. I really don't feel conflicted at all. And I've been very clear to other board members that I have a role in this, and I have a different role when I go someplace else. And I think Dave Walrath and I were having a conversation earlier that when I sit on the Commission of State Mandates, I'm the chair of the Commission of State Mandates in a quasi-judiciary role, and oftentimes I vote against finance, who are my colleagues, but that's what I do. I mean, this is the hat I'm wearing today. So while I agree with you, Rich, that we can't tell the future, we rely on actuarial work. I mean, that's the basis. If we were to throw the towel in and say we can't tell the future, we were in deep doo-doo. We need to rely on some guidance from the actuarial work, and we trust you. Otherwise, we would have somebody else doing our actuarial work, I hope. And so I think that the low point would be do nothing. And so, I mean, that's clearly out there already. Do nothing is the lowest point possible. We're already 11 billion lower, than we were a year ago, according to the letter that we have now. So that's not an option. And again, going back to our fiduciary role, what is it that we need to do? And I think that given GASB, given what we're hearing now, that's why I do the 30 years and let the legislature figure out how soon, by whom, when, and whether or not that's doable. But beyond that,
Arguing with you about that.
No,
We can define our tolerance based on what we know. How low.
But I guess at the end of the day, it's really not the board making a recommendation, it's the experts making a recommendation. They met with interested parties, And I know the finance was at some of the meetings, not at all the meetings, but, you know, and other people were at the meeting, not all the meetings. I get that. But, you know, they're looking at STRS, not the STRS board. So I think for us to say, you know, and that's where I raise the issue is when we say STRS does this, I want to make sure that is, as far as I know, the board has not taken an action to say we ought to do it gradually, or we ought to do it this, or we ought to do that. And I just want to be clear on that, that it's, this board member hasn't voted on that.
Can I chime in before I
Yep.
get too far behind?
Sorry, Nick, I didn't
No,
see you.
that's okay. We've been referenced a few times, so I just wanted to say, you get back to Pedro's comments. I mean, if we're going to recommend anything, we're not going to recommend anything that's less funding than 30 years. I mean, you know, there's other factors there. I mean, we realize that what 30-year funding was, you know, 15, 17%, and maybe that's not going to happen. I don't know, but we're not going to recommend anything less than that. Do some of these things, do the scenarios address the long-term funding? Yes, they address it to a certain extent. I mean, you know, and you know what, you know, it's this is you know, what does address mean? But I think it addresses it, and some address it better than others, and that gets back to Rich's comment, which is, and the board has been great about that, sitting through the stakeholders, the previous meetings where the stakeholders were there. What I really appreciated was the board was like, these are just targets. You know, you have to set a target. You have to do it based on, as Pedro said, you got certain assumptions. You got to set those assumptions and go off your target. But that target is eventually going to get off course, and you know, then hopefully it gets off course the good way and the bad way. But at some point, you're going to have to address it probably one way or the other. And that's, you know, one thing in this report, which I think has been really well addressed. It's, you know, been made clear that, you know, things aren't going to turn out exactly as we expect. I mean, just for example, there was referenced the unfunded went up. Well, we actually expected that because of the way the smoothing the assets worked. That wasn't, you know, a huge surprise, and it was partly the investment return, but that was expected. We expected to go down for the next couple of years just because of the smoothing. And then that gets to my next point, was kind of what Rich was talking about. I mean, if personally, from a comfort level, if I have a scenario where I see the funded ratio increasing and not flat, then I'm going to feel a lot better. So, and obviously the next couple of years, just the way, you know, the smoothing works, I mean, you know, we expect that, and it's going to take a while. I mean, it's potentially, depending on how the contributions come in, it may take a while to ramp up. Once again, we would definitely feel much better if it started in 2014 versus 2016, and obviously bigger increases versus smaller increases. But we would definitely, I mean, I would be much more comfortable seeing a scenario where it was projected increase instead of stay flat. I think I got, yeah, I think that was all the points you guys had talked about. Thank you, Dana.
I already have Terry, Paul, and then Harry, and between Terry and Paul, I am going to go to the mics. Terry?
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I think we're starting to, at least I think I'm hearing a bit of a consensus, but I'm probably that comment's premature also, I'm not sure. But I agree with Ian that once this goes to the legislature, it becomes a living document. I mean, it's going to stick with this body from then on. And I kind of see it right now as it's going to be an informative document to the legislature. It's going to be a working document. It's going to be a tool for hopefully consensus building and dialogue with the legislature over the next couple of months. In that sense, I think the words to address the system funding question, our scenario 4 poorly addresses it, and I think we need to be clear on that point. And therefore, I think we have to, as Rich said, define the boundaries of what will satisfy and hopefully protect this system from the risks going forward. We know that doing nothing, it's going to run out of money. Some of us, I think we all agree, just doing something is a start, but we need to go well beyond just doing something. We need to define the boundary of what is at least adequate scenarios going forward.
Alrighty. Jennifer? Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, Jennifer Baker with the California Teachers Association. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for the amount of time that you've given to your staff to work on this, and the time that they worked, and the colorful conversations that they put up with from stakeholder groups clearly has shown, at least in my mind, let me let you know that there has been an absolute understanding that anything less than full funding in 30 years is not acceptable, period. There's a clear understanding of that. That said, one of the reasons when the legislature was having a conversation about this bill, they felt it was very important to include in the bill to have a conversation with the stakeholders, because there was a realization that this issue goes beyond only CalSTRS, that it will have an impact on potentially Prop 98 and potentially other budgetary items. That was one of the reasons they wanted to make sure that there was a broader conversation so that you and your staff could help understand the political and the fiscal context that this was being discussed. This is a report. This is not the final solution. This is not the final bill. You can very easily state in the report, it is our fiduciary belief that anything less than 30 years is not going to be acceptable from our perspective, period. And then you could also say, that said, we understand that the legislature may choose to address a solution that is less than the 30 years. If you were to do that, these would be various scenarios in what you're going to get at the end of the day. If you choose to do X funding or Y funding or Z funding scenarios, these are going to be your long-term options. Because if you do not include that pertinent information is not going to be there at the time the discussions are taking place. That then leaves you out of that conversation. And there's a very short window. So if the legislature then has to come and ask you for information, that means they're already having the discussions. By the time you give them that information, that window may have already passed, which is why I would certainly encourage you, include more information. And it was very clear from reading the report that many of those scenarios are not going to be viable options for the long term. Anyone who actually reads the document is going to understand. And if people are only looking to editorialize, which they're going to do anyway, that is going to happen. But your role is to make sure that everyone has all of the facts, including facts that could lead to a less than full funding scenario, so that the legislature can choose to do what they think they're going to do at the time. When a bill is eventually introduced, whether it's a bill or whether it's included in the budget, that's certainly going to be information that's going to come to you so that you can take a position on that. So the reality is this isn't the end of the discussion. This is merely going to be a tool to the legislature and those that are having the discussions to have the kind of factual discussion that they need to have. So that said, I really wanted to thank Ed and Marianne, and to thank Sharon for putting up with the various stakeholders and the colorful conversations that we have. This is not an easy discussion, but we do appreciate the fact that you're truly taking the time to have as comprehensive of a discussion as possible.
Thank you, Jennifer. Sal?
Sal Villasenor with the Association of California School Administrators. It's very difficult to follow Jennifer because she steals everyone's thunder. But I concur with a lot of her statements, and do want to recognize that as the association that represents the superintendents of school districts and school administrators, being part of this conversation as early as we started is very, very important to us, because budgets ultimately will be impacted at the local level. And knowing what all the possibilities that exist on how to address the shortfall, which we agree needs to start now, not later, is extremely important to us. The other thing I must remind this body about is that you are dealing with a very different legislature, very different. You're also talking about legislators that have a 12-year term. So taking that into consideration, I think it provides for a very, I think it's more of a positive opportunity, because you're going to have legislators in in key roles for a longer period of time. And as we find this fund or the decisions about how to address the shortfall, either falling short or having challenges, I think you're going to have legislators that at least will have been there from the start. And I think that's a very important factor to consider. So we appreciate all the work that you've done, and we're appreciative of being part of that.
Thank you, Sal. David?
Chair Dillon and members of the commission, my name is David Bala Hawkins. I represent the Community College Faculty Independents. We're a federation of community college faculty. I heard your actuary comment that they're an attorney and they didn't understand the legislature. I'm not an attorney, and unfortunately I understand the legislature all too well. But this report is extremely balanced. You had sign-off from all the stakeholders, including Department of Finance, including staff representing both the Assembly and the Senate policy committees. So we believe it's well put in here, and again, we had anonymity, that there was, that the tone of the report was very balanced. So in looking at, as Mr. Reyes said about, looking at scenarios where we're only funding, a lower percentage than even below 80%, the legislature's already asking these questions. I've had questions asked about, well, what if we do an increase of this percentage? And I can't tell them because this hasn't been approved yet. So the legislature wants to know what the different scenarios are. That's very clear. I think that the tone of the report does accurately represent what you feel on a fiduciary basis is the best approach. My counsel would be that there's going to be a cover letter attached to this, and that in your cover letter you can pull out those pieces that you most want to stress about the board's position and have that included in the report when it's distributed. And then as Chair Dillon mentioned, there are going to be scheduled meetings to have those face-to-face conversations. But the report itself, I think, is not only comprehensive, but represents all views and aspects of your role as oversight of this fund. I think the report's great. Unfortunately, with legislative members, you're going to have a lot of them not read it, and it's unfortunate. So having a cover letter that sort of emphasizes your top 3 points and what your concerns are, I think is more inappropriate. That may be the only thing that these members read. What my colleague Sal mentioned about the legislature, you have the largest freshman class now since I believe 1967. I mean, they're barely finding the restrooms right now, as opposed to talking about major policy decisions like funding employee retirement programs. So this is clearly a step-by-step process. But providing them the information, there were some comments about, do we need to do this? Yes, you do, because the members and their staff are already asking these questions. They want to know what options are in place, what will happen if they don't pursue certain options, and the report, Ed Durham and your staff and the participation of the committee members, this is an excellent piece that you've done, and you have, beyond the expectations of the author of SCR 105, responded accordingly. And again, a cover letter I think would help emphasize some of your highlights.
Thank you, David. Dave?
Dave Walrath, representing California Retired Teachers Association. Just to follow up and not repeat what everybody else has said, this is a state plan. The state will decide how it can best meet its obligation to provide full funding to the plan. SCR 105 was to give them scenarios on and inform them of how best they can address that responsibility to provide full funding. As David just mentioned, a cover letter talking about the emphasis on the importance of 30 years, the emphasis of starting sooner rather than later, the emphasis of starting with higher contributions rather than lower contributions. That's in the report. We believe the cover letter is just simply pulling out of the report those pieces that you want to emphasize. 30-year is the goal, but the practical reality is we're not sure exactly what's going to be in 30 years. A 75-year goal could get us to full funding in 30 years as well. We all recognize this is an evolving process. And to follow up on Rich, yes, the legislature will want to know what is the least possible. that will be the conversation we'll be having on how do we move beyond the least possible to the greatest possible. And that will be where the debate is, but that is the debate of the legislature and the governor, because it is a state system. It is their obligation to meet that requirement. Ours is to give them the information to inform them of how best they can meet that requirement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Andrea?
Hi, thank you so much. Andrea York on behalf of the Faculty Association of California Community Colleges, and I'd just like to follow up on Dave's comments. Early in this conversation, we talked about moving the needle on the gas gauge. Of course, no one appreciates that we would love to be fully funded more than we do. And also, no one is going to be fighting harder for a solution than the stakeholders are. And this report gives us the necessary information to take back to the legislature to find the best possible solution in a political reality that's very tough. So I urge you and thank you to adopt the report. Thank you.
All right, Paul?
I think you've got somebody else.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Mark McDonald with the Los Angeles College Faculty Guild. And just to expand on everything that my colleagues have said, and not to repeat anyone, but to expand also on what Rich said, this is a very comprehensive report. As Dave said, the tone is great. And I think that not including the various scenarios and only going with the 30 years diminishes the impact that the report will have within the legislature. As Dave said, they're going to be looking for the least possible scenario. And if you're only going for 30 years, then you've almost written off the report in the legislature. So I would encourage you to adopt the report so that it can be most useful in the legislative discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. There's been a couple comments about adopting, and I just want to make it clear, this is informational. It's an informational report that we're going to move forward. Consensus would be great, but it's not something that we're going to vote up or down. Alrighty. Paul?
I think we come back to the fact that while there are lots of realities out there in the context in which the legislature is going to address this issue, we have a single-minded role here, which is as fiduciaries, to see that the system is funded. And we recognize there are budgetary issues out there. They're important. They're essential. They're not the concern of this body, sitting here as this body. And so I'm still, for reasons I stated earlier, think we should take out all the 75-year scenarios. But if we're going to move in a direction of putting them in, I think that it's really important that we make it crystal clear in a much more detailed and expansive way than is in the report now. And I know it's due in 4 days, but it's going to be a document that's going to live for 4 years or more. If it takes us a few more days to get it right, I think that's the right thing to do. It's not just that 75 years takes a long time. It's that 75 years is very risky, because what happens if, and it's very hard to read those diagrams, and I'd love those graphs to be bigger, but some of those scenarios, we are down at 50% funding for 50 years. And as Nick said, what happens if we have a couple of bad years when we're, for 50 years at 50% funding, we tumble down to the point where this is not addressing the problem. And so we should make, if we're going to put the 75 years in there, we should make a really, first of all, we should bring up into the body the statement from Milliman about, they can't recommend anything more than 30 years. We should expand on the risk that this exposes us to, and we should say very clearly that it is not clear that our actuaries could tell us that these are solutions that address the problem. I think it needs to be much clearer. I think there has to be a sharp dividing line between 30 years and 75 years, the risks of 75 years, the implications, what our actuaries tell us, what our fiduciary duty is. And on that basis, if the rest of the board wants to see 75 years in there, I'm all for consensus.
Michelle? I'm sorry. Rich?
Close.
Wrong. Had Michelle's name.
We're
And I did so good
virtually the
earlier.
same, Michelle and
I did so well earlier. I am so sorry. Rich.
Actually, you go to the better half of my nature. I actually completely agree with Paul. I think we ought to state really strongly, and I don't think we've done that, that as the fiduciaries for the board, that we think that a 30-year scenario is the right scenario and one that aims at 100%. Understanding that that may not be right, but that's where we ought to be headed, that that's the right thing for us to do. And somewhere in the report, I don't know if it should be in a cover letter or in the report, we should state that our very strong preference is that they pick a scenario that takes us there. And I think all of us are comfortable with that. That's the right thing to do. There are that's the right thing to do in our context. There may be other right things in the right context when it gets over the legislature. I'm not ignorant of that, which is why I think that we ought to show them, frankly, I think we ought to show them what the consequences are of deviating from these things. But I agree with some of our constituent groups, and I think I agree with most everybody on the board, that we really ought to make it clear that this is where you ought to be headed. This is the right way to be headed. And so I mean, to the extent we can adapt appropriately either the executive summary to the report or a cover letter to the report, I think that would make all of us, or the report itself, would make all of us comfortable, because I think we think pretty strongly that that's what we ought to be doing.
Thank you. Aaron?
Appreciate all the comments that have been expressed this morning. Agree with many of comments made by board members and also members of the public. Appreciate the work that's gone into the report. One of the, I think Nick mentioned this, is that something to the effect that so long as we're seeing the funding ratio improve rather than remain flat or decreasing is really what we need to be addressing, and is the key objective here. That this is simply a long-term problem that has to be addressed. I agree, ideally it would be addressed within 30 years. I think that should be stated, that that's the desired outcome. That the longer we wait to increase the contribution rates, the more expensive it's going to be, the more costly it will be to do so. What's so frustrating about this is that, frustrating I guess is the right term, is that we don't have the who and how much the rate increases are and when they take place are completely in somebody else's call. And we don't know what the markets are going to return. We know we have a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And it can be addressed in several ways, and one of those ways is to increase contribution rates. And the sooner we do that, the better. And there are 3 places where those increased contribution rates can come from. So I'm comfortable with the report. I do agree that there should be some emphasis on the 30 years being the goal, with also the realistic expectations, the expectations that so long as the gas gauge is moving in the positive direction, from my perspective, that would be addressing, not solving, but would be addressing the unfunded liability issue.
Lois?
Thank you, Dana. Lois Shive, CTA NEA, retired. And first, I'd like to thank the board for its diligence, its time, all of our staff, all of our consultants that work with our various groups, the time that you've spent in putting this together. And what I bring at this point, just this small point in time, is memory. And if memory serves correctly, back in the 80s, we were at 55%, with no expectation that we would be any higher. And then in the late 90s, we were close to 97%, and with no expectation that we would be any lower. And we are where we are today. We didn't see the sidecar rolling through the legislature of a rogue member who went to a legislator and asked that legislator to please pass a bill that would give that member his own private bag of money. That was our 2% sidecar that established the DBS fund and short-funded this wonderful pension fund by a huge amount, building on to what we have now as a snowballing effect. And I remember when Ed Durman was talking to me back in the early 2000s saying, Lois, we have a $28 billion unfunded liability. Well, you know where we are now. But what I would ask, please, that you consider, because we create a legal fiction with the document. We say 30 years when we don't know what will happen, let alone tomorrow, but in 5 or 10 years' time. By giving the full birth to that 30 to 75-year scenario, you give us those touches in time that we can at least regard, have some that are literally tossed out as being unacceptable, and those that become acceptable and that will need to be revisited at another time. So I ask you to take the document as it is, not shift any comments in favor of or against another position, because then we have the appearance of favoring one thing over another, which I think we would all be cautioned against, as history teaches us. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lois. Sharon?
Thanks, Lois, for the history. I guess I concur with Harry's comments. I think that what I hear the theme this morning has just been around our fiduciary duty. That's what I keep hearing, and I hear that in Paul's comments and the other comments that are being made. And I'm in a place where I think one of the things I love about being on this board is I just have so much respect for my fellow board members, and I think we take our jobs here very seriously and that duty very seriously. And so, I'm comfortable with, some of the comments you made, Paul, in terms of, and other comments that are made here about a cover letter or trying to, I appreciate Lois's comments about not emphasizing, but I also think we on this board are, the fiduciary duty piece and our role in that, and especially with the information that Milliman's providing, I think that's what I hear us wrestling with about a little bit this morning. And so if there's a way that we can, with our cover letter, or a way that we can be sure that we are making comments and statements that, if there's a statement that we can include from Milliman or something where it allows us to feel comfort level with our role as fiduciary duty, so that we're making sure that it's not going to be construed as we're making a recommendation or giving information to the legislature that would somehow shirk our fiduciary duty and be contrary to the comments that Milliman's making. Does that make sense, Ed, or does that?
No, I understand. I mean, it's really, in terms of the way that the conversation seems to be gelling around comments, this doesn't require, however you want to deal with it, I can deal with it probably this afternoon. So if a cover letter is sufficient, that's fine. We can do it there. We can make some other adjustments within the report itself. I can work with Nick. He'll be around for a few more hours, so sort of get that language right. But I understand what you're trying to say. You just want to make it clear that from the board standpoint, this is what you would prefer. You just recognize that there's other outcomes with different other possibilities with different outcomes that you do want to communicate to the legislature, but you're expressing that as fiduciaries, that this was the preference, this would be what you would do if you were in this position.
So,
Is that,
Ed, let me, because I think we're getting there too. I do have a couple people in line, but what I see us gelling around is leaving in the 75. It's not everyone's preference, but I think it's the majority of the board. Including a strong statement of our fiduciary duty. I think that the preference of the majority of the board would to add that into the body as well as in the cover letter, where the cover letter would state our point of view of our fiduciary duty quite strongly. And then I think the bringing the actuarial opinion from Milliman into more prominence within the body of the report. I think the board would like to see that, and maybe possibly making, I don't know how to bring more prominence or highlight the risk of the exposure that we have if we have downside on the market, but maybe bringing that into some more prominence.
we did
also.
have an example in there, I was just trying to find it now, but there was a comment in here about, it was in the discussion on page, let me see if I can find it quickly. There was a discussion around the rate in which, it's on page 22, where we talk about, you know, an example of if the market goes down 10% per year in the next couple of years, that we go from a 63% funded on a market basis to a 40%. I mean, that gives you a sense of that. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that the board was looking for, but that would give an example of that, and we could maybe see if there's a more prominent place to put that or talk about that. But we can certainly talk about the risks of extended funding periods, less than full funding, and maybe beef that up a bit if that's what the board wants.
Already,
Yeah,
go ahead,
Can I
Sharon,
just
you
finish
still have the
one
floor.
more? I just was going to make another comment, though, that Marianne Ashley, is she in the room somewhere? She and I are going to be, we have a legislative whirlwind planned for the next, I think, 2 months. I'm flying up for 2-day stints with Marianne. We're going to get to know each other very well. Pretty much February, March, April, as long as they'll meet with us. So we're doing a power, you know, we're meeting with legislators so they'll have the report, and then we're there to talk about funding, how important it is that we're funding the system. And again, I want to remind the board that I'm here really as a liaison. I don't speak for the board, but I'll definitely fill you in on our conversations probably at maybe the next board meeting. So I just wanted you all be aware that that's happening too. So there'll be hopefully interpretation as well.
Thanks. Paul?
Thank you for your summary. I think that's moving us in a good direction as to the changes we'd like to see. But I wanted to address that last issue, because the reality is that the needle is not going in the right direction on any of these for a while. It drops in all 8 cases, and in some cases it doesn't come back up to where we are today for as many as looks to me like 60 years. Now, Ed, I asked you a couple days ago, I don't know if you had a chance to get that information, because I asked the question, I'd like to know how many years it takes us under each of these scenarios to just get back up to where we are today. Because a 75-year goal to get to 80% funding still seems to me, as I eyeball scenario 8, the needle is down below where we are today for 65 years. And it's only in the last 10 years that it starts to go back up. So I think the way to describe that risk is to talk about that, is to talk about not just that, you know, one example of, well, if we're at 60% funding or 50% funding and we have, you know, two years of down markets, but to say the risk of these longer scenarios is that we're dropping for a while and we stay down for a long period of time. And it's one thing to worry about another market collapse in the next, you know, 5 years. It's another thing to worry about another market collapse in the next 65 years. And so I think describing just a little bit more discussion of what these numbers look like and what they're telling us, because this is what Nick said early on, is you know, that this is the problem. You're down this low, and then you have another serious drop. And several people have said, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. That's absolutely right, and things might get better. But my worry is, you know, to be honest, that's a high-class problem. The problem that I worry about, especially because this board can't set contributions, is what happens if we don't anticipate what happens and things are a lot worse. So that's what I would say. I would, you know, maybe just take one of these examples and spend a little bit more time talking about what it really means.
Ed, you good with that? Yeah. All right. Pedro?
Madam Chair, I think it was in the last hour that we introduced this concept of the cover letter, and it sort of makes sense because then a report ought to go with a cover letter. But I'm sort of struggling with what this cover letter is and who signs this cover letter, since the board hasn't voted on anything. And so if the cover letter is to say the board supports this, or the board encourages the legislature to consider this or that, I sort of think it's kind of a backdoor vote on where we stand on a report that is informational before us. So I'm a little bit concerned with what the cover letter would say, and I haven't seen it, and it's going to get drafted by this afternoon, is based on what I'm hearing. Or I don't know how we get to discuss what the cover letter says, because I just don't like the idea of a cover letter conveying my views without me seeing what those views are. And I guess, you know, based on comments from everybody, I continue to be in the minority in terms of what I think our fiduciary role is. But that's okay. I can live with that. I guess that's sort of my main point, is I'm a little bit concerned. And then the question I have is to Ed is we have this debt that's due. The report is due when? The 15th, and the force of law for us to be late, the penalties for us being late.
No, we just want to abide by the legislature's wishes. They want to get going.
And originally, the goal was because they wanted to have a hearing late in February. Now it's been moved to March.
Right.
So I mean, so this issue of you can't do a rewrite because we got to do it. I mean, I'm not looking for a rewrite, but I'm
I don't think
thinking
a
that
rewrite's required. So I'm not concerned about being able to meet the deadline.
What I hear you saying,
Yeah.
you're gonna edit it
You can do it
today
today.
potentially and talk to Nick and.
So I
But
guess
this,
okay.
but Pedro, this is our last opportunity to
Right.
have a discussion about it in public.
Right.
So
No,
it's pretty much the last opportunity we have to talk about it.
And I
We
think
meet in
what, you know,
March.
I got an email, and basically here's the draft of the report, send us your input, and I thought, well, Bagley Keene says that I should have this conversation in a very public forum, and so that's why nobody got my input until now. So to staff, I apologize for not giving you a heads up of what I was going to say. But to the public, I'm meeting with Bagley Keene obligation, which is to tell you where my
I
thought
hope you're not
process is.
implicating the rest
So you know
of us.
how I am. I'm pretty blunt and honest as my thought process goes.
Well, I think all the board members complied with Bagley Keene in the
Okay.
process.
No, I did.
And the
I
point,
really
well,
wanna convey
I just to make a
No,
legal point,
absolutely,
those
absolutely.
board members have provided comments. Those are the public comments in the back of the room.
Mm-hmm.
And it just provides for better deliberation of the stakeholders, so they have a chance to think about it too. We don't want to
Mm-hmm.
surprise people with dramatic ideas today, and I think that's why we want to make sure it was fully compliant with Bagley Keene, but also make sure everyone that's worked so hard on the report had a chance to think about things too. That was the reason
Okay.
for it.
So I just want to,
So for me, Pedro, I think what the cover letter would talk about would take our view that we believe our fiduciary duty is full funding within a 30-year period. I mean, is that what you're, instead of me saying what you think the cover letter ought to say, why don't you tell us what you think, what we want the cover letter to say? I hope that made
And then we'll
sense.
tell you if you're right or wrong.
What are you hearing from us?
Well, it'll
What do
be
you
more
want?
than just being submitted upon your request. Here's the report. But no, I think we would highlight, and I think we would probably highlight the nature of the discussion today about, from a fiduciary standpoint, that the best approach is to be fully funded within a 30-year time frame. But there's a recognition that there may be alternative approaches which have consequences that are outlined in the report that don't address them as successfully as what our preference is. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it that way, but that's sort of the tone of it. I think, that the letter would sort of highlight the 30-year funding as the preferred approach, but we want to make sure that people understand that there are other options, and those are discussed in the report.
Madam Chair, would that letter be then signed by Jack?
I would have seen it signed by the board chair and myself, just representing the leadership. But your call, you decide.
But the question is, we haven't voted on this, though. How can
Well, I don't
the
think you
chair
were
sign
gonna-
on behalf of the board when the board, and it's not an
Well-
action item either, so we really couldn't put it up for a vote.
Your call.
And so
How you-
that's my concern.
I mean, Dana
Madam
signs
Chair.
letters regularly.
I think it's appropriate for Jack to sign it.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And you
Yeah.
guys had to do this to me today, of all days.
But I want to say it's simpler. I mean, often letters go legislature are like, we're transmitting the report required by this bill, and there's no information on transmittal letters. That's the classic bureaucrat letter that goes to the Capitol. The question here is whether you wanted to amplify a few key points, but not raise additional thoughts. I mean, that was your idea this morning. I heard you shaping. So, I mean, that, to me, that's what a letter would do. If you wanted a little more substance and not just a bureaucratic transmittal, you would pick a few key points. So it's a mini executive summary, if you want to say, of 2 or 3 points. And you would, so you all have trust in each other today. You would talk about what those 2 or 3 points are. It sounds like you are. And Dana would have to give concurrence that that's what she heard. And I mean, I think if you want to have a little more substance, that would be a process to, I'd hate to see you tie yourselves up over a transmittal letter. I've never seen that before. So, I think.
But from my perspective, if I get a letter signed by the chair of the board, then the board is presenting this issue. If it's a transmittal letter, because, so here's process-wise being the bureaucrat and being the legislative staff.
Mm-hmm.
The legislature asked CalSTRS to come up with something.
Mm-hmm.
CalSTRS staff has met with many groups to come up with something. CalSTRS staff put an information report before us for discussion purposes. So now CalSTRS staff can provide either A, the bureaucratic letter that says, pursuant to your request, here's your report.
Right.
Or CalSTRS can say, staff can say, here's your report, and it appears that we prefer the 30-year process.
I think it's your
this,
call.
the issues that we're talking about. But then it's your signature, not a representation of what the board.
It's your call.
That's
I'll gladly sign it.
That's
but,
this member's view, because I think that to have the chair, the vice chair, or anybody else from the board, even our legislative representative, conveys a board action of some sort, and no such action has taken place. Not just me.
Okay, so on the whole signature thing, let's get that taken care of. Thumbs up, thumbs down, chair signing.
Have we ever done this?
I've never.
Okay, well, I got 2 people that don't even want to play.
Wow. Well, I wanted to comment on that. If
Well, I did too.
Can I comment on that?
Okay. Pedro, you done?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
By the way, it was split up here. So we're not making a decision on this, we're not making a decision on the signature yet. Paul?
We can't see up here, okay.
Well, I think if the board chair is gonna sign it, that reflects that this is what the board thinks. And I guess what startled me, to be quite frank, Ed, is your summary of what would be in that letter was not at all what I thought this consensus of this group is. I mean, your words were, and we're providing other scenarios that, quote, don't address as successful. Now, that's not my feeling about this. The 75 years, in my opinion, I wouldn't describe them as they don't address as successful. I think of them as scenarios that are at serious risk of not addressing the problem. Okay? So maybe we need to discuss that, because that's not the way I think about it. I don't think it's the way some, if not most, of this board thinks about that. And I really worry that I don't think we should have a cover letter at all. And the reason is because I really worry that it's going to be taken as the summary. Nobody's going to look at the report, and especially if there's something in there that says, and here's another situation, another option that also addresses the problem, maybe not as successfully, takes on a life of its own, and it is not in any way a reflection of what this board member thinks.
Well, if I can't, I was just being asked off the top of my head what it would be. Obviously, I'd look at it very carefully in the language. We just want to make sure it's clear that the report is more than just saying, spending 25 pages saying we think 30-year funding is the only way to go. because clearly there's more information in there that we want to make sure that people are aware is in the report. Obviously we would write it in such a way that was consistent with the tone of the report itself, which is that this is your preference. This, from a fiduciary standpoint, this is what you think it ought to be. It should be 30-year full funding.
That's what I was thinking.
And there are risks associated with doing anything other than that, and that we highlight the nature of those risks.
Yeah, and that's what I thought we had reached some sort of consensus on. Is that? I know you
Yeah,
want to cover
that
Right.
stated that
Yeah.
way, yes.
But I
Okay,
think
so
we
we
do have
good.
to take a break. I mean, you're asking about.
No,
I mean,
no,
it's,
it
with
was
the board's point of view, a vote on
very
fiduciary
different statement.
responsibilities
Sorry, it
is
was
this.
very, very,
Okay.
very different statement.
All right. So we're good with that. Well,
We're working on that.
I had people bail. I had people bail out of line. So, Pat, we'll come to you, and then we'll take on that.
Thank you very much. Pat Geyer, retired teacher. I just had one thought, and that was going back to the elder full funding, that there might at some point be a way of inserting something into these plans and to get the legislature to say that if the funding falls below a certain percentage, that it would be increased. The legislature would automatically or would increase it in some way. So I just a thought of putting that in, which might make some of these scenarios a little less difficult, because there would be a guarantee that if it fell below a certain percentage, the legislature would be obligated to make it whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Rich?
I think the only piece that's left over is who's gonna sign now, because I think we're really pretty close on this. And the board has talked about this extensively, has helped shape this report extensively. For us to somehow say it isn't ours is a little disingenuous, even if we're not totally in agreement on this. And I don't find it odd that Dana would, as chair, would reflect that by signing on. This sort of thing happens all the time. And it is, frankly, I'd prefer a minute action accepting the report as we expect it to be amended. We apparently have noticed the conversation in a way that doesn't allow us to do that. That would make me happy. But other than that, I just don't, I think the distinction that it is somehow ours but not ours. It wasn't, the legislature didn't ask for STRS staff to prepare a report. It asked for STRS to prepare a report, and that includes us. And I don't want to, frankly, I don't want to back away from the shaping we've helped to do on it. Yes, I fully give staff credit for doing 98% of the work, as is always the case, right?
We provided direction.
We helped, and we stand, and I want to stand by it. Frankly, I think it's a good document. So I mean, if there's an objection for, maybe we could just let anybody that wants to sign on, right?
I think that'd be a very bad idea.
Well, I think so too. But I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable with. I'm perfectly comfortable with Dana, signing on as it's our work product as well.
And I feel very comfortable doing that. Sharon?
I just think, we're CalSTRS. Jack's we're CalSTRS. So I guess to me, I hear your concern, Pedro, and it's an information item. I think as a board, we've had, again, multiple conversations. We today are having this conversation. I don't really like the idea of it just sort of being the staff signing, to me that just seems strange. Like, we're CalSTRS, we're part of this. So I'm not saying that when you sign that letter, Pedro, you're saying, you're signing off on something, but I would hope that today you would have some comfort level in saying, hey, we're okay with the information we're providing forward. I just don't like the idea. I think we're CalSTRS and we shouldn't, separate the two.
Something, not that they probably would, but we could include information within something that we give them when we give them this report. The links to the archived video of our discussions, so they can hear what we had to say about it. Idea. Pedro?
Yeah, nobody's gonna.